Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to OAG's latest webinar. I'm Becca Rowland, and I'm a partner at Midas Aviation, and I'm going to be hosting today's webinar. Our topic today came from a conversation about American Airlines cancelling flights last month, as they didn't have enough pilots. So we thought it'd be interesting to take a look at where else supply-side issues might be holding back airlines from fulfilling demand I'm tongue-tied this morning, aren't I? Where else airlines might be hampered as they try to come back as demand picks up. So what are the supply side issues affecting them there? We will, of course, be looking at the current state of the industry using OAG's extensive data, as we always do. And you'll be getting the webinar afterwards, and please do, as usual, ask your questions as we go along. We're picking them up mostly as we chat, and I think that's quite a good way of having a good discussion. So keep your questions coming in using the chat function on the webinar. To help me explore these topics today, we've got OAG's Chief Analyst, John Grant, with me as usual. Welcome, John.
Hi, good morning, Becca. I'm not tongue-tied at the moment.
Yeah, I know. I don't know what happened there. I'm not normally tongue-tied. We're going to be talking about aviation. I guess that's good for you. It's been a hard week for the football. I have to mention the football because you often usually start by talking about football, but with the Euros, it's are we just moving on to aviation now?
Yeah, I think we need to move on, Becca. We haven't got much time today.
Okay, lovely. And it's good to have Gary Bowerman with us as well. Gary is Director of Check-in Asia, which is a travel intelligence and strategic marketing firm with bases in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Kuala Lumpur. Gary hosts the Southeast Asia Travel Show. He founded the Asia Travel Reset and the Asia Pacific Travel and Tourism Report, and is author of the new Chinese Traveller Business Opportunities from the Chinese Travel Revolution. So, Gary, you've been pretty busy, haven't you?
Yeah, good afternoon, Becca. Good afternoon, John. Thanks very much for having me on the show. Yeah, we're in Kuala Lumpur. It's a lockdown situation, continues, but yeah, there's so much going on. There's so much chatter. There's so much governmental announcements about what may happen in the region. But at the moment, there's a bit of a travel stasis going on right now.
Yeah, but it sounds like your work with the whole travel ecosystem means that you're going to be a really good person to help us unpick where there could be supply side issues today. So thanks very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Before we move on to our first slides, we thought it would be good to give the audience a poll today. It's a fairly basic question. I think it should be coming up on the screen in just a moment. Have we got the poll?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, I'm not seeing it, but that's maybe because I've got a wrong screen.
So the very simple question is, when do you expect a recovery in the Asia market? Select one of the following: winter 2021/22, summer 22, winter 22/23, or summer 2023. So we'll just let that run.
Now I have to open the window. I've got it now in front. I can see the answers coming in. Thanks everyone for voting. When they stop moving, I will close the poll. There's still a little bit of movement. Keep your votes coming in. We haven't defined recovery for you, but I'm sure you'll have your own sense of what recovery means in your markets if you're listening.
Perhaps we should have put in brackets optimist, realist. Right. I think we probably stop.
Shall we? Oh, there's a little bit more. A few more people coming in. People waking up now. Okay. Still a few more votes coming in.
Yeah, we're there, I think.
Okay. Shall we close the poll now? And I don't know if are the numbers available for everybody to see. What we are seeing is almost half of people say summer 2022.
49, yeah, 49% summer 22.
So a full year away still. Goodness me. What do you make of that, John and Gary?
Personally, I think that's verging slightly on the optimistic still. I'm unfortunately becoming more and more pessimistic about the pace of the recovery, the behaviour of the regulators and governments, and controlling of second or third or fourth spikes. I think summer 2023 is perhaps a more realistic assessment. Gary, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree, John. I think there are so many variables right now. It's really, I mean, one thing we've learned over the last 18 months is predictions are really, really difficult. I would agree there are so many variables. We're going to talk about vaccinations later. That is a crucial component. So are new variables. You know, the worst thing that could happen will be another new variant coming into the region here. It's going to be a phased recovery. I think that's very important to mention as well. You know, there's going to be several steps. Some countries are going to be ahead of others. So in terms of a whole recovery, yeah, I would say 23, 24 even.
Yeah, really interesting. So it's thank you all for taking part. It's interesting for us to bear in mind that we have an audience today that's quite optimistic about recovery, and perhaps a little bit out of sync with where we are. But let's carry on, and we'll see whether the analysis changes your mind, I guess. So let's start looking at some of the data we have from OAG. We always show a couple of slides like this at the beginning. This shows the last 12 months of capacity data globally at a monthly level, and it's showing the comparison this month versus the same month in 2019. So we're not comparing back to 2020 at this point because it was so disrupted last year. We're seeing a continuation of the trends that we've seen. We are seeing improvement, aren't we, John? That there's the broad trend is upward month after month, isn't it?
It is. The broad trend is being driven by the very, very strong recovery in Western Europe in the last 6 to 8 weeks, as countries have come out of lockdowns and we head to the summer season and low-cost airlines and fighting for sunbeds on the beaches, and by the North American market, which essentially, for all purposes, is the United States, which has been recovering very, very strongly. So those two markets, which are two of the three largest markets in the world, results in a picture that looks like it's improving. We've gone from -39 to -31 from June to July. So it looks as though we're heading in the right direction, and we are in some parts of the world. But then equally, this is a pandemic of swings and roundabouts, and for every opportunity and every gain, there is seemingly a loss somewhere else. So Southwest Pacific, Sydney, with an outbreak of 112 COVID cases on Monday, enters a 10-day lockdown. Well, my village has got 112 cases of COVID in a week. So I mean, there's maybe a degree of paranoia, and that I think we'll discuss that. That's a big issue.
It's so general, isn't it? Looking at these general numbers, they hide so much detail within them. And I know we always get questions about, what about China, and can't we pull China out separately from Asia? So I have put the number for China here. China overall capacity is 1% up in July versus July 2019, while Japan is at -60%. So within Asia, massive difference there.
Absolutely.
And about Europe is that's international travel, isn't it? Where the other markets we've seen where there's been more recovery, it's been domestic China, domestic US, but Europe is international, isn't it? So that's a step forward.
Well, it is, but we've all been told that it's a single market and it's a European Union and there were no borders. So do we treat it as domestic or international? Asia is a real worry for me, Becca, and Gary can speak more to that. Indonesia, less than half the capacity from 2 weeks ago as they fight another Delta variant. Malaysia, I just see that it's stuck and it's going nowhere, certainly not for the next 3 or 4 months. And then, of course, we've spoken about Australia, but Qantas are saying probably no international flights before the end of the year. And at that point, the pledge to Australians, I believe, is just availability of a single dose of the vaccine by that date. Gary, it must, where you are, you must be just treading treacle. It's a horrible situation.
It's really an enduring holding pattern, and it just seems to be no end to it. I mean, you made a very good point. You wrote in your report earlier this week about Indonesia, which has sunk like a stone in recent weeks. You know, I think it was up in the top 5, you know, based on its domestic capacity a few weeks ago. Vietnam dropped out of the top 20 completely. There's only one country in Southeast Asia, I think, in your top 20 right now, and that's Indonesia, and that's right near the bottom. And as you said, Becca, you know, the capacity that exists in this region now is purely domestic. Here in Malaysia, we haven't had any domestic travel since mid-January, so you know everything is on hold completely, international and domestic travel. Indonesia is really suffering right now. You know, it's a horrible situation that's happening there. The Delta variant is just skiving through the country. Thailand also is in big trouble at the moment. Vietnam, which looked like it was controlling the virus pretty well last year, you know, that's suffering particularly in the big cities. You know, it's the big cities that are being hit hardest, and those are the suppliers for domestic travel. So you know, you look at Jakarta, you look at Ho Chi Minh City, you look at Bangkok. You know, they're really struggling, and those really support domestic travel economies.
Okay, we've got the same sort of pattern of data for the last 8 weeks. This just shows a little bit more detail of the recent past. Anything more to add there when we look at a weekly pattern, John? Other than we can really see the Southwest Pacific numbers falling down. So that started happening before the latest outbreak in Sydney.
No, I think one of the things we have to recognise, and these numbers I think show it, Becca, is over that 8-week period, it is always a percentage point up or a percentage point down in most markets, and you know that's country markets as well as regional markets. We are seeing very little change week on week. It's just so frustrating. You know, we're at 79.8 million seats a week at the moment, and everyone says, you know, that's good compared to last year. But when you actually look at the underlying characteristics of the recovery, you know, it's so fragile in most places.
So let's take a look at the numbers by country. There's quite a busy chart here. What we've got here on the left is capacity for the country, and I've split out domestic and international, so you can see how much the domestic capacity is down or up, and how much the international capacity is down or up. And we've taken a bunch of the major markets. What we've got on the right-hand side here is vaccination rates sourced from our World in Data, which, if you haven't looked at it, is a great website with huge amounts of data. It's very accessible and all free. So you can see the proportions of the population fully vaccinated and partially vaccinated. The China numbers are what they're showing, but I think the China numbers they may be counted in different ways, so they may be quite different to that. So I'll just say a word of caution on those numbers perhaps. But it's interesting, I think, when I was looking at this, there's not really a correlation yet between international travel and people, the proportion being vaccinated. I know we're seeing vaccinations as the sort of way out of this, but that's not really happening now, is it? It's really international travel is being driven by government policy still, what people are allowed to do.
Policy and politics, I think. You know, I mentioned it in my weekly blog, but there are just so many inconsistencies, and the laws of unintended consequences. It just seems ludicrous that US nationals with their passports can come to Europe, and yet no Europeans can go to the United States. However, any European can travel to Mexico and spend 2 weeks on the beach in Cancun and then fly directly into the United States unchallenged. It makes no sense that people from the Middle East at this moment in time, the large expatriate community who are flying back to Europe, are spending 7 days in Menorca or Mallorca or Barcelona and then flying directly to the UK and arriving unchallenged. And rather than allowing us to control the flows and know where these people are coming to and from, we're actually creating false indirect markets that will, cause so many problems in terms of track and trace. And for a country that has over half of its population vaccinated, It's just inconsistent. What was the point of everyone getting vaccinated? I think your next chart, Becca, just highlights in a slightly easier way, I think, where we stand.
Yeah, I just wanted to stay on this for a moment though and bring Gary in, because I think you've got some interesting information about, the difference, say, between Malaysia and Indonesia, Thailand, in terms of, Malaysia's got a smaller population, so they don't have any manufacturing capability for vaccines, but when they do start vaccinating, they'll probably get there a bit quicker than the likes of Indonesia and Thailand that have got manufacturing capability, but they've got large populations. And how do you see this sort of interaction between vaccination and travel playing out in Southeast Asia, Gary?
That's absolutely a very good point. When you mention those countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, one of the reasons they're so far behind is supply of vaccines. That everybody got off to a very, very slow start. As you mentioned, Thailand and Indonesia are manufacturing under license for other vaccine manufacturers, but they're pretty inexperienced at doing so. Their capacities to actually ramp up the necessary production is quite low. And so all countries that are relying on donations from COVAX or from Japan, China, even the US, and that obviously impacts the actual supply. It's very difficult. Malaysia is a good example. You actually have to register to get vaccinated. So you actually have to register via an app. And then matching the demand against the supply is quite difficult when you're not quite sure when the new supplies are going to come in each month. Now, one of the bright spots in the region is Malaysia right now. The last 2 days, it's actually broken 400,000 vaccinations per day. It's accelerating pretty well. The government has mismanaged the whole COVID-19 situation pretty badly, but the one thing they did do well was they did put their most capable minister, Khairi Jamaluddin, in charge of the vaccination program, and he's done, I think, unequivocally a fantastic job. I'm vaccinated, fully vaccinated, and I would say both visits to the vaccination centers were exemplary. It was very, very well organized. But when you look beyond Malaysia, as you said, it's a population of 32.7 million people. It's not that huge. When you start looking around the region at countries like Indonesia, that's the 4th most populous country in the world, over 270 million people. Vietnam is closing in on 100 million people. I think Thailand is around about 70 million people. So those are pretty big populations. And when you have such a standing start in terms of both supplies and vaccinations, it's going to take time. I think it's even here in Malaysia, although there is an acceleration in terms of vaccination rollout, the actual appreciable value of this isn't really going to be seen towards the back end of this year.
And while we're talking about some of these countries, in the last 2 weeks, Thailand's opened its Phuket sandbox. Are we seeing that make any difference?
Yeah, well, that was so long. That was so long and drawn out. We've been talking about it for a long time. Okay, so I mean, in positive terms, Thailand is a standard bearer for rebooting general travel in Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific. It's the only country that really has announced how it will phase its reintroduction. So as you mentioned, this was actually started on the 1st of July in Phuket. Samui starts this week, and Thailand has said that it would like to reopen the whole country by the end of October. But when you actually look at the numbers, it's going to be a very, very slow build. Yesterday, for example, there were 3 flights into Phuket, and they brought a total of 396 travelers. In the first 13 days of the Phuket sandbox, they've had 5,174 arrivals. Extrapolate that out a little bit. Through the end of September, they have 187,265 hotel room nights booked. So this is going to be a gradual reboot. It's going to take time. Even the Phuket Hotels Association said that for its peak season, which is December through March, it's only really expecting between 30 and 40% hotel occupancy during that period. That ordinarily would be up in the 90s. So it just shows you that it's going to be a real gradual reboot. And the key factor to most of this is that without China, without Chinese travelers into this region, a recovery of any sort simply can't happen.
And what's the talk about when China might open? We've talked before about maybe the Winter Olympics in February would be the moment when they open. But I think we're hearing that it might be further away than that.
Yeah, if you hear Chinese officials, particularly health officials, they get asked this question quite a lot, and their standard answer, their stock answer, is that China will reopen its borders when it's safe to do so. And at the moment, it clearly isn't safe to do so. China is very, very worried about the Delta variant coming into the country. It has, as you've got, your figures there, it's actually distributed or actually administered 1.39 billion doses of the vaccine. But Chinese vaccines around the world at the moment, there's a lot of controversy about their value. But in terms of the staging post, you're quite right there. They are hosting the Beijing Winter Olympics in 2022. It's during the Chinese New Year holiday. That's when it begins. And they don't want anything to get in the way of that happening. Probably boycotts from around the world pending. We don't know what will happen there. Another staging post that I think is quite interesting is later this year in December, is the China-Laos high-speed railway is due to open. Now, this was the first part of a major international project to build high-speed railways throughout Southeast Asia that will connect with China's own high-speed railway network, which is the world's largest. So the Laos project has been built over the last few years, and it's due for completion later this year, and it's supposed to open in December. Now, you can't really imagine that project, as high profile as it is, would open without Chinese travelers on it. Now, I don't know whether they'll create some kind of bio bubble for it to happen, or whether it'll actually get pushed back into next year. As it stands at the moment, throughout this region, Chinese travelers are not coming back anytime soon.
No, goodness. Okay, let's move on. We've got another slide here, which is it's the same data. We've just presented it in a slightly different way. So along the horizontal axis here, we've got how the international capacity is versus where it was in 2019. And on the vertical axis here, we've got the proportion of the total population that have had at least one dose. I tried labeling these 4 quadrants, but there isn't there is only a sort of a broad theme for each of them. Clearly, these countries here are the ones that, many of them with a 0 case policy, New Zealand, Australia, certainly China to start with. These places that are saying, the goal has been to keep the case numbers very low, but also having fairly low levels of vaccination. While up here in the top right corner, we've got places that have got higher levels of vaccination and a bit more international capacity perhaps coming back. John, did you want to comment on this and say, what can we take from this?
Firstly, I think it's a great visualization of the data, and it makes the point quite clearly. I did label them. I mean, I think the bottom right cluster can only be described as the foolish and the reckless. The bottom left hand side is the no hopers. The top left hand side are the ultra conservative cautious. And those few countries that are in the top right hand side are the smarter countries that seem to have got some control. I think it just shows that there is no consistent policy. We've spoken before about how can a country like Mexico literally have had open season throughout the whole COVID-19 pandemic and just let it ride. And similarly, not just Mexico. I mean, we've seen other countries in Latin America, Brazil, adopt the same strategy. And it's just frightening that you would expect all of these countries to be clustered much closer together. You would expect the more developed Western European countries all to be in the same space. I think the bottom left is a fair reflection. We know that we've been speaking for a long time about those countries that are in trouble. So it's just a good visualization. I think what would be interesting, Becca, would be to revisit this and see how some of these move over time, if indeed they do. Yeah,
I mean, I think our expectation is that vaccination will make a difference as we move forward. I mean, it surely has to, but it's just taking a while, isn't it, to work its way through the system. I think one of the things that's interesting for me is when we look at the US here and Mexico, an awful lot of their international capacity is just between the US and Mexico. And we also know that some of you were talking earlier about people making sort of strange routings in order to get to places. And I certainly know people currently traveling from, they're in Spain now, traveling from the Middle East, park themselves in Spain for a bit in order to get back to the UK. And also know somebody who's in Mexico at the moment who's traveling from the UK to the US and doing it via Mexico. But there's also vaccination tourism taking place, isn't there, from Latin America up to Miami, we hear. So all sorts of interesting travel patterns that, you know, we wouldn't normally be looking at those market segments. We can't necessarily capture any data about what's happening. It's purely anecdotal, so we don't know the size of these sort of travel flows taking place.
No, and of course, you know, they're frequently not on the same booking now because hello, that, you know, that's a clue, and they may get spotted. But you know, I think one of the fascinating things is, you know, we've now got a new definition of what a tequila shot is. It, you know, it's a shot through Cancun on your way to the US.
Lovely. So we'll be referring to the tequila shot market segment in future, will we?
Yeah. Yeah.
I would just say, Becca and John, I would say in that bottom left-hand quadrant, if you remove Brazil and Peru from that, you know, that tells another story, is that, you know, intra-regional travel is so important in Asia Pacific. It particularly was over the last 5 years of the last decade. That's where real growth came. And everybody's watching each other at the moment in the region. There seems to be generally pretty low level of trust between governments across Asia Pacific. You know, there are some deals that are trying to get done. Singapore and Australia have been talking about doing a travel bubble, but that's been kicked into the long grass at the moment. Generally, there just seems to be low levels of trust, very different rates of vaccination, very different rates of managing COVID-19. And, you know, those countries are so important to each other. And that's why I think there is just this great hesitancy right now.
Yeah. You know, and when you look at Australia and work we've done, and I know you've done, Gary, as well, the size of the education market to Australia from places like China, from South Korea and Japan, you know, they're going to miss another year of education students. And it's not just the students, it's their families, the visitors, the economic impact. And you've got to question, when are they going to realize that they can't continue like this? You know, that they've all got to break out of this some way or other.
Yeah, I think this is one of the strongest lobbies that's happening in Australia right now. I mean, there are several going on. There seems to be a lot of anger at the government. You know, let's not forget that the government wants to get re-elected next year. So that does explain part of its caution. But you're absolutely right. The education economy goes beyond travel. You know, it knocks on into real estate, into retail, all sorts of angles, domestic travel, visit family and friends. So it's a big micro economy that was built up over the last decade that without it, you know, really hurts Australia's overall economy.
Okay, I'm going to move us on now because we've still got plenty of slides to have a look at. The next one looks at capacity globally and how it's changed over time. So using the snapshot feature that we have in OAG's schedules analyzer, we can look at what the capacity was at previous points in time. So I've selected 5 here, back from sort of mid-March, mid-April, mid-May, mid-June, and then now. And we can see how capacity has come out of the schedule continuously. And I think when we were looking at this, we just felt, as we got to the summer, the middle of the sort of what we generally call the summer, I know it's not summer for all parts of the world, but we wanted to have a sort of "we told you so" slide, because, you know, we've been saying for months now that this was going to happen, that the summer wouldn't be what it was being predicted to be back in March and April. And this really shows that, doesn't it, John?
Yeah, we told you so.
Yeah, we told you so.
You know, there was no way it was going to come back. And I think my concern would be, Becca, that people still, some regulators and government agencies still have not understood what is going on and realized where we are in the recovery. 79.8 million seats this week. Average load factors probably 20% below what they were in 2019, if not more. The loss of high value international travelers, and specifically business travelers, over the last 18 months. 79.8 million is probably very close to the peak of what we will see this year, given current circumstances. You know, we will in September begin to see capacity pull back in some markets. We'll probably see new outbreaks and spikes and additional travel restrictions. Many parts of the world have still got to fully experience the Delta variant. And it's just frustrating. I see Willie Walsh at IATA today has lambasted the European Union regarding their insistence on 60% of slots being used by airlines this coming winter, or they'll lose them. Airlines aren't in a position to be able to do this. It's just ludicrous, and we need help from regulators. And it's such a shame that politics and politicians and people who don't have industry experience are making decisions that are impacting hundreds of thousands of qualified, experienced aviation personnel around the world.
Yeah, very sober numbers. So I'm guessing that we're going to see this line. If you're saying that we might be at a peak now, then this is going to plateau off here, isn't it? It's
yeah,
very tough. Okay, let's have a look at something slightly different. This is some new data, John, isn't it, that you've got hold of at OAG. What it's showing. Well, do you want to talk us through the numbers, John?
Yeah, which is always code for I can't explain it.
No, I'll just talk to them.
So we've had this data for a long time, but we've just pulled it in a slightly different fashion. So what we've been looking at is what are the patterns when airlines are making changes, and how far before travel are they actually making those changes. So we've taken a cluster of fairly large airlines here, and you can see very distinct patterns of the number of days before travel that the airline is making the change. And this is for the first week of July, so this is data from 2 weeks back. And you can see that the US carriers are making those changes probably 3-4 times earlier than many of their peers. And the reason they're able to do that is because they have security of network and security of market. They effectively have given up on international traffic because the US and the Biden administration have given up on traffic, but they also have a very strong and growing domestic market. So they're putting these changes in place and they're seeing the reward of that activity. Whereas all of these carriers at the bottom, who have quite a large proportion of international capacity, are sweating and hoping until the last possible moments before they make schedule changes, and they have to put cancellations into their systems and other such activities. And it's all of these carriers who are making relatively last minute changes are essentially in a situation where they are at the mercy of the regulators, and in turn that frustrates consumer confidence because people don't know if they're going to travel, can they book hotel accommodation, should they even book on these airlines and on these routes. So it's a very, very frustrating situation from that perspective. But it's also quite interesting to see there's different behaviour in the alliance groups. So, as we say, there's on average a 17-day differential between schedule changes made by Air France and Delta, who are the two principal members of SkyTeam, and similarly 18 days between Lufthansa and United within the Star Alliance. But I think it just gives you both an illustration of the challenges the airlines face and the subsequent impact on consumer confidence. And if we do have clarity of market and what is and what isn't open, how much more resilient and how much stronger and confident the airlines can be in their network planning.
That's very interesting. I'm sure we'll come back to this at some future point to see how as the markets recover, more airlines are able to put in place the schedule and not change it at short notice, and behave a bit more like these large US carriers that are able to depend on that domestic market now. Very interesting. We'll come back to that. This is another look at snapshots of data. We were wondering how airports are seeing capacity come back, and whether we're seeing more concentration at certain times of the day, whether we're seeing the wave pattern of connecting, flights coming in and out develop, or whether there's just more capacity coming in, perhaps at the beginning of the day, the end of the day. Very different patterns at different airports, aren't there, John? I think we're just showing 4 here. So Shanghai, Dubai, Istanbul, and Sydney. So a range from Asia Pacific and the Middle East.
I think as much as anything, Becca, this shows that airlines, or certainly the base airlines at these airports, are seeking to rebuild their hubs and seeking to rebuild that connectivity. Now, that's admirable, and we'll come on to some of the challenges of that from a resourcing perspective a bit later. But I think it's worth pointing out, and we've discussed this on previous webinars, as we recover and connections begin to occur again, and we see reasonable flows of traffic from international flights to international rather than point to point, which is essentially all we see at the moment, then minimum connecting times at many airports are going to have to be extended because of increased protocols, turnaround times, deeper cleaning of aircraft, checking of valid visa passports, vaccine passports, etc., etc. If you take an airport like Sydney, which has a curfew, there is a very large peak of arrivals between in the 1800 and the 1900 hour from Asia and from the Middle East, where the aircraft is actually turned around in amazing efficiency, sometimes under less than 2 hours, and then sent back before the curfew occurs at Sydney Airport. Now, if these minimum connecting times are extended too far, and too far may only be another 45 minutes on a minimum connecting time, and an aircraft has 2 or 3 turnarounds in a operating day, that will add 2 to 3 hours on the aircraft's daily operating program. And in the case of Sydney, will completely blow the curfew, with aircraft stranded from carriers like Emirates and Etihad and Qatar and Singapore Airlines, unable to depart until the next morning. And the implications of that in terms of their scheduling and slots and both current and future slots is incredible. The knock-on effect, the ripple, will flow through all the way to London Heathrow and other such places. So seeing the recovery is good, but we've not yet tackled the issue of processing passengers' minimum connecting times. And when we begin to think about that, we may be storing up a problem for ourselves further down the road.
And I guess at some point, it's probably too early, isn't it? But at some point, we will start looking at whether we're seeing minimum connect times change. I guess we need to start looking at some specific routings and see if the timings of flights are changing to take into all of that into account. But I think it's too early to see that, isn't it? There's not enough international travel to be able to see any patterns, really.
Yeah, I mean, a connecting passenger is rarer than an England penalty taker.
Yeah.
It's fascinating looking at that Dubai graph set there, because I mean, I used to fly through Dubai in the old days all the time, and that airport comes alive at 11 o'clock midnight. After the early hours, that place is packed. That tells a real story, that graph.
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? And this, I was interested by just how well Istanbul is doing, but we know Istanbul's doing well. They're getting a lot of traffic, international and domestic, really, relative to many places. Okay, so we started, American Airlines was where we sort of started thinking about what we would talk about today, and the fact that they basically cancelled flights in mid-June because there were too few pilots. And we know that the problem of pilot shortages was something that was around before the pandemic, but for them this was about just this mismatch of demand coming back and how do they service that demand. And so we've got a few slides that look at different aspects of this supply side now. So it's this peak on the 20th of July is when they cancelled flights due to a shortage of pilots, and then they've had a few more peak bumps since then. their response, I think, was that they said publicly they were going to take out about 1% of flights for the following 4 weeks. And this chart in the bottom left shows that the grey line was the capacity, or the not flights, it's capacity here, that was in the schedule before the 20th, and then the yellow line shows how they took it out after that. And there's a big dip here for July the 4th holiday, which would be expected. So they did pull back some of the capacity, and then by now it's just catching up to where it was. Some of this was weather conditions, I think, as well. You know, this is the time when they have storms, so they would expect to see cancellations. It wasn't massive cancellations compared to what sometimes happens, but it is something to be aware of, isn't it? How do they bring back all the things they need, like staffing, as demand picks up?
Big challenge for every airline is to match their resource recovery with the demand recovery, and it's not easy. And you know, there are factors outside of their control. We saw that at Heathrow on Monday, of course, where, you know, a lot of security staff were pinged and told not to go to work because they were at risk of being infected. And suddenly, you know, there was no security staff at T5 in Heathrow, or very few. And an airline operations department will perhaps at midnight think that they're fully rostered and ready to go for a 6 o'clock start the next morning. And by 3 o'clock, they may have numerous staff who've been pinged or contacted in various parts of the world saying you can't go to work. So for airlines to have available resources to get back to full-scale operations is very challenging, Becca, very challenging.
I don't know how the systems work elsewhere, but in the UK, yeah, if you've been in contact with somebody, you get pinged, as John says, saying you need to self-isolate for a period of time. So there was huge queues, and I guess probably some flights left late, and then that knocks on to schedules in other places as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you know, the crews that are there go out of hours without operating their full duty hours and operating day. It's like a deck of cards, you know. It all begins to cascade down once one part of this logistics chain is broken.
So in terms of I guess pilots in particular, we know that there were issues before the pandemic. I think I found a Oliver Wyman poll in 2019 of operations leaders, I think, in airlines, that said 62% saw shortage of pilots as a key risk. And in the US, you've had an aging workforce facing mandatory retirements, and in China, it was a matter of just keeping up with growth. So, you know, will people think twice about training as a pilot when it's also cyclical, or are we going to see, you know, I think Ryanair have said they're going to take on 2,000 new pilots, and they're actually going to invest in training, aren't they? So where are we going to see pilots coming from as we move forward?
Well, you know, we're going to see them reappearing from all sorts of shapes and previous careers. For some people, it's, you know, it's the dream job. Let's hope they don't dream whilst they're doing it. But for others, you know, it had become a bit of a grudge and a bit of a very on the treadmill type environment, getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and then, you know, doing the late shifts a couple of days later. So we are going to have a shortage. There's no doubt about that, and we do need to be investing in the future now. Some airlines are already looking at single cockpit operations and the practicalities of whether they can work or not. And we will see some changes taking place, no doubt about it. But I think we become quite fashionably or quite emotionally attached to thinking about, you know, pilots and cabin crew and all of these sort of people. But it's also the security staff. You know, where are the security staff going to come from? And some of the most simple things, such as getting their IDs approved again. You know, all of the IDs will have lapsed. They'll probably need to go through the administration process again. That can take a period of time. You can't just suddenly bring back people of 1 week notice. Many of these are really, really challenging. And, you know, as Michelle said here, some airline and airport staff are refusing to go back to work until they've been vaccinated, and they're not on any priority list at all. So how do we ensure that the people who are on the front line are vaccinated and given priority over others? Because we need that for the industry to kick on and move forward. But it will also, Becca, I think, lead to some significant changes in how people travel, the travel process, use of biometrics, online check-in, baggage drop. Where it used to be, those moments of truth were when the customer interfaced with a staff member of an airline. It will now be, the first time you talk to anyone will be when you get on board the aircraft.
Oh, and we know that there are many airports using this time to invest in more technology to make the process contactless. So I guess, but it's not a quick fix, is it?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
So it's not just staffing at airports and airlines. We've also got supply side issues, I guess, at hotels, and we were looking at hotels and car rentals and thinking about that in particular. So this is some data that's come from the US. I haven't found something equivalent in Asia, and maybe the market's not picked up enough that there's data. But just looking at revenue for the different types of hotels in the US, sort of airports are doing middlingly well compared to sort of urban hotels that are doing have taken more of a hit, and resorts are doing a bit better. So, if people aren't traveling internationally, then hotels obviously are massively affected, car rentals massively affected. I think, Gary, you were saying in Asia, it's resorts is where the revenues are down most. So in contrast to in the US.
I think it's a bit of both. I think that the problems you've had with resorts in most countries of the regions, they've had to reprice. They've had to reprice for a domestic market, which means dropping rates. And that really impacts everything. That impacts your staffing levels, that impacts your quality of service, that impacts the new services that you can develop. And sometimes that even impacts the level of guest service. I traveled at Christmas and New Year here, and some of the hotel resorts up in Langkawi, which is a holiday island here in Malaysia, that you could see noticeably the staffing levels were much less than they were before. And that's a difficult issue to come out of, especially when you're pricing your resorts for local travelers. When international travel comes back, you have a big gap there. So you have a big pricing issue. I think the issue for urban hotels has been slightly different, because most of the city hotels don't really want to drop their rates. They've been trying to do other things. I work with hotels in China and Hong Kong, and what they've been trying to do is just add value to the staycation or whatever. So you're trying to add extra services like free meals, free drinks, free spa treatments, other things like that. Trying to theme some of your promotions, so you can theme some of your stays for couples or for Mother's Day, Father's Day. You can do it for families, that kind of thing. Just trying to segment a little better than you did before. But the other problem for urban hotels in this region is a lot of them have been used as quarantine hotels. And so obviously straight away, the government allocated funds for room rates are very, very low. So that really hits your rate again, which hits your bottom line, which again hits your service capacity. So here in Malaysia, it's a very, very difficult situation. The hotel economy is basically on the floor. We've had some big name closures of big city hotels here in Kuala Lumpur, in Penang. Many others are shuttered and unlikely to come back. In Phuket was the same. Many hotels were closed for a long period of time until the Phuket sandbox opened again. China again is slightly an outlier here, because it did recover, particularly in urban travel, much quicker, and so the hotels are open. But again, a lot of the hotels in cities are tailoring their services to local residents, because with these stop-start movement restrictions and travel bans, even within countries, it's very hard to model and plan ahead.
And we had a question about, should airline and airport staff be mandated to be vaccinated to be able to work? But I guess the same applies for all parts of the supply chain for travel and tourism, that you can have airport and airline staff vaccinated, but if your hotel staff aren't vaccinated, will people want to travel? What's the thinking in the countries you work in about the mandatory vaccination of people in these industries?
Yeah, well, I can speak for China. China certainly prioritized hotel staff, all front customer-facing staff across the travel sector, prioritized those. So, that really prevented any kind of lag in terms of rebooting the hotel sector. In this region, it's more difficult to tell. So, if you look at the Phuket sandbox, for example, that was predicated on 70% of the local residents in Phuket and the hotel staff being vaccinated before it reopened to international travelers. Those international travelers themselves have to be vaccinated. But even so, there have been a case, I think it's about 7 cases of infected travelers in the last 13 days. That's going to happen. People that are vaccinated can still catch the virus. It's probably too early to say in other countries at the moment how that will roll out, because so many countries are so far away from actually properly reopening. But if you do want to reboot your travel and your tourism sector, yeah, you have to prioritize frontline staff and consumer-facing staff.
Okay, we've got a slide just to look quickly at car rental supply as well. We don't normally look at things like car rental when we're in aviation, but it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because we're certainly seeing in the US car rental rates going up massively, and I gather that's the same in other places as well. So even once, I think these things are interesting, because even once we can get people traveling more domestically, more internationally, if things like the hotels or car hire is massively more expensive than it was before, what role does that play in demand for travel?
Well, Becca, you'll recall we were talking yesterday to Buddy Anslinger, who will join us this afternoon, and he was saying, what was typically a $40 rental for a car at an airport in the US for a one-day hire is now $120. And my own personal experience, I currently sit with a car hire booking for the United States that I paid £800 for. Not for a day, I hasten to add. And if I was to buy that today online, it would be a £2,400 rental price. So yeah. Prices have tripled, and I think we don't sometimes appreciate the impact of no aviation market has on the whole travel ecosystem and other suppliers. Hertz having to sell these cars because they've had to go into Chapter 11 and refinance. It's crazy, and the consequence of that is, are there enough taxi drivers at US airports to take people to and from their locations, right, where they used to hire a car? And in Asia, Gary, I think car hire has never quite been as large as it has been in other parts of the world, but it was beginning to roll out, wasn't it?
Yeah, so before the pandemic, I'd say for about 3 or 4 years before the pandemic, Chinese, Northeast Asian, Southeast Asian travelers to Australia and New Zealand, those 2 countries in particular, the occupancies for car rental companies were going up. And if you wanted to try and rent a camper van or a car during the Christmas or New Year season, or even most of the Australian summer, it was almost impossible unless you were really willing to pay premium rates. That has transferred into domestic markets, definitely. You're right there, John, in terms of how it's affecting the supply chain. Across the last 16 to 18 months, more people have been taking self-drive vacations throughout Southeast Asia, throughout Northeast Asia. You mentioned there that Korean travelers have really picked up on this. A friend of mine was telling me that they're even offering tutorials for camping cooking, because Korean cuisine is quite complicated to cook. So Koreans are learning how to cook camping cuisine. But, these kinds of things are quite interesting. I think after the pandemic, this will be a huge area for investment across the region. There were 2 things that have kind of held it back so far. And one of those is the administrative requirements, the licensing requirements in terms of self-drive trips in Southeast Asia in particular are quite complicated, and it's quite difficult to rent a car and go into another country, for example. It's okay if you're doing it within country. And the other one, quite simply, is that tourism boards and governments completely ignored it. They didn't pay any attention to self-drive travel. I think that will change, because they've seen the way their own domestic travelers have really picked up on this. And they're starting, the interesting thing in many of these countries, Southeast Asia in particular, is you just have such a diversity of geographies to go and see. And a car enables you to go to places that you couldn't otherwise do. It also enables you to control your own itinerary, to build and manage your own itinerary, and to feel a bit more safe. You can radiate away from the crowded cities, and you can take your family or couples or whatever, a group of friends, and you can go and have a holiday out in nature, which I think is going to be one of the initial comeback trends here in the region. I
think that's going to be the case in many parts of the world. It's, I think we're going to see that. I mean, obviously, car rental for holidays is more common in Europe and North America, but I think those underlying patterns are going to play out everywhere, aren't they? Post-pandemic. Yep. Interesting. So we've got 2 more slides just to have a look at in the last 5 minutes. We always focus mostly on Asia Pacific in this morning webinar, and so we can't really go without talking about the Tokyo Olympics. Not really sure that there's a lot to say, is there? It's an Olympics with state of emergency in place, with a ban on international travellers, with no spectators. We know from looking at Olympic events and big sporting events in the past, people always expect a lot more travel associated with these major international events, but when you actually look at the data, it doesn't really make much difference to air travel. So in some ways, perhaps this isn't so different to what we would see normally, but there's not a lot of air travel associated with these Olympics, is there?
No, it's a sad situation for everyone. You know, the organising committee, the amount of effort that they've done, the fact it's been rescheduled and it still can't happen in its full glory, the athletes. And of course the airlines, and it's completely blown the JNTO, the Japan National Tourism Organization's ambitious targets for tourism development. It's an amazing country that really hasn't developed international tourism to its full potential, and was looking to use the Olympics to kickstart that and move things on. All we can hope is that the TV companies do the event justice and show not just Tokyo, but also the landscapes, the scenery, and the attractions that exist.
I think we've said for a while it was such an opportunity, wasn't it? Because Japan has definitely been a much more of an outbound market, and then just in the last few years they've really realised the opportunity for their economy of welcoming inbound tourism.
And sitting next to what was the world's largest aviation market during COVID-19 and will be the world's largest aviation market in the future, China.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in 2019 they had 9.6 million Chinese arrived in Japan, which was an astonishing figure. They were, as you said, John, they were aiming for 40 million tourists during the 2020 Olympics. Obviously it got delayed. You know, this does say a lot about what's actually happening in the region, happening in the world right now. I think it's a great shame that there's no domestic spectators allowed into the stadiums, because I think that would really showcase the best of Japan. You know, they're great sports fans. They will really support the events. I think the only hope here is that the Olympics pass off pretty successfully in terms of not many infections. You know, that would at least give some hope that events like this can be held in the region safely and securely. But without the international domestic travelers, you know, as a spectacle, it'll not be nowhere near what it could be. But you know, if we can get to a month's time and it's still safe and secure in Japan, or more than it is right now, then that would be some degree of success, limited as it would be.
And it is, you know, the Olympics is a large TV event as well. So I'm with John in that I think there's a huge opportunity for Japan to showcase everything else that it has to offer tourists. And you know, I know that Japan's on the bucket list for many people as a place to visit, so there's still a big opportunity, but we have to see how they handle that and whether they make the most of that opportunity, not for tourism obviously this year or maybe even next year, but you know the next few years there is an opportunity, isn't there, for them to see more inbound travelers.
Yeah, absolutely. It will be a fast regrowth market. You know, when it does reopen and it is safe and secure, Japan will definitely be a big regrowth market for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it ticks all of the criteria for what we expect the recovery to be, doesn't it? You know, it's regional. It would not be difficult to get home very quickly if you're a Chinese traveller. You know, it's got you can socially distance if you want to, if you go into the countryside. It's got shopping, which certainly a lot of Chinese people enjoy. So yeah, it's in the right place. It's just faced with an unfortunate set of circumstances.
Okay, and we have one more slide with some data. We thought we'd just revisit the Tasman bubble and what's happened there. Has it delivered what was expected? I think we said a month or two ago that there was a clear evidence of pent-up demand in that first month or so after it opened, but then capacity fell back a bit. I guess people who really wanted to travel and needed to travel had done so, and then there was, you know, just the uncertainty that either side could close it down on the basis of cases. This is where we're seeing it now. The yellow line is capacity up to July, and then this is the capacity in the schedule going forward. It's not huge, is it?
No, and I think we can, you know, we can expect that it will fluctuate depending on the demand, and even when the bubble remains open, you know, people will be looking very carefully at what the infection rates are, if indeed there are any more infections, and making judgments about whether they will book for the next 2 weeks or 2 months in advance. Amanda's asked an interesting question, which I wasn't aware of, and I'm slightly surprised at, that you don't have to do, or you've not had to do a PCR test, and it's only just been introduced on the Australia, New Zealand, Tasman bubble, and it's costing $120 per passenger. Well, that's probably as much as some of the airfares, and this is a problem we're seeing not just in that market, but in many markets. Airfares are between sometimes 30 and 40% below their normal market prices at this moment in time. But when you add on all of the additional cost of travel at the moment, such as PCR testing in both directions, sometimes quarantining at £1,700 for 10 days or whatever it happens to be, and the administrative burden to travel, it's those frustrations and complications that are discouraging as many people as are, you know, able to cope with it. It's a nightmare of bureaucracy, and to turn up at an airport and be turned away, as has happened in the UK in the last few days, because you have a vaccine that was produced in India rather than produced in the United Kingdom, is just going to destroy confidence and confuse people further.
Yeah, I think with the bubble, you made a good point there, Becca. I think that, you know, initially, particularly visiting family and friends in the other country, you know, that happened at the beginning when the two-way bubble was reopened. So that now has slightly dampened demand. It's also winter as well. So between those two countries at the moment, travel flows would generally be relatively low, unless you're going to Australia, unless you're going from Australia to New Zealand to go skiing. You know, and New Zealand itself actually opened up a travel bubble to the Cook Islands. So if you're in winter in New Zealand, you want to go for a summer holiday, you can go to the Cook Islands, and that's obviously going to dampen traffic in the other direction to Australia. You know, I think both countries are hoping it will build up towards the summer season there, but it's going to depend on vaccination rates. Both countries at the moment still a little bit behind on that.
It just shows, doesn't it, how difficult it is to get a market working, even where it's just two countries. Just so difficult. How we're going to open up internationally, you know, and more widespread is anybody's guess, really. We've just gone past.
The good news is Becca, the good news is the Australian government hopefully will be re-elected, because that's clearly what they're aiming for from their strategy.
So we've just gone past the 9 o'clock. We should close it up. Any final thoughts from both of you, particularly on this issue of the supply side having to match up to demand as it comes back, and what the issues are?
Frustration, just immense frustration at the difficulties that are being placed on companies that have already been brought to their knees during the pandemic by complete lack of clarity from regulators around the world. You know, no joined up thinking, no prioritization, no understanding of the value of aviation to global GDP, and, you know, the economic recoveries in places like Thailand are so dependent on aviation being able to trade and operate in a near normal manner. If I had any hair, I'd be pulling it out.
And Gary, any final thoughts from you?
I think that's absolutely exactly spot on. It's very difficult here for airlines to plan and to model into the future, because as you say, the government regulations, the rules, the border issues, they keep changing all the time. It's often without a great deal of reason. You know, the countries just haven't managed to get a handle on this, and that really is impacting the whole supply of travel. And that's going to be really hard to rebuild demand, because we don't know. You know, one of the issues that you would imagine is that airlines can rebuild their supply and watch the demand patterns. But you know, people across this region have been repetitively told every single day to stay at home because it's dangerous outside. We don't know psychologically how that's going to impact them when travel actually is able, when you can travel again. Now, there will be a lot of people that are vaccinated and probably think, well, let's take a holiday, but there will be a lot of people that won't. And I think managing the reboot of demand is that's going to be a big issue.
Gary, I think that's a really important cultural thing, isn't it? In Asia, society, it's a generalization, but society is much more compliant with direction, whereas in Europe, whilst people are compliant, I think they've reached the point where their patience has been tested, and they are now, you know, looking at other options to break out of that compliance.
I think that, yeah, I think there's two aspects to that. I think one is that definitely people have turned to their governments for guidance and for help in a very, very difficult situation. That did happen in this region in 22, 23, 24, sorry, in 2002, 23 with SARS. It did happen again with the MERS outbreak in South Korea in 2015. So there is this feeling that governments can guide people through this. I think the other one, which often gets overlooked a little bit, again, it's a generalization, but if you look at healing and wellness philosophies, mostly from Asia, they do focus on prevention. They focus on not getting ill in the first place, whereas the Western side of the world tends to look much more at medication. There is a pharmaceutical solution for every single illness. Now, that's not to say that pharmaceuticals aren't used in Asia, because of course they are, but generally the mindset is that you avoid any likelihood of getting ill in the first place. I think that is often overlooked.
Very interesting. Thank you both very much. It's been really, really informative today. Thanks for your time. We will be back in September. We take a break in August, so I think we're back on September the 22nd. Thank you very much for joining us if you're listening in today. We will be sending out the link for the webinar afterwards, so you'll have that. Please do sign up to the blog, and John produces a blog every Monday with the latest from OAG, so do keep in touch with that. Thanks very much, and that will be the end of our webinar today. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.